Hello, I'm Nick Clark. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, climate saviors, not just victims. African leaders demand more funding to transform the continent into a clean energy powerhouse. Also, held back by mountains of debt, African nations demand debt relief to help unlock funds for climate solutions. Plus, Pakistanis are feeling the pinch of power bills, and anger is mounting over the impact of strict reforms imposed by the IMF. So, a resource-rich continent that's contributed the least to global warming. Africa loses up to 15% of its economic output every year to the devastating impacts of carbon emissions. And yet, the continent has received only a fraction of the funds needed to help tackle extreme weather. Africans have long been seen as victims of climate change, but now leaders in the region want to transform that narrative and become champions of climate solutions. At the first Africa Climate Summit in Kenya, they've demanded wealthy nations pay their fair share and invest in the continent's green energy potential. African leaders proposed new global carbon taxes to fund climate change action. Billions of dollars were pledged to help reduce global warming. And that includes boosting carbon credits, which are bought by companies to offset their emissions. But campaigners say the approach allows large corporations to continue polluting the world. We'll discuss all of that with our guest shortly. But first, the Kenyan government says climate change and related effects have overtaken poaching as a main threat to wildlife. A new approach to wildlife conservation is underway in the nation, where people and wild animals are living side by side. Michael Apple has this.
See the elephants over there.
Nelson Oliraia drives through lands that are almost unrecognizable compared to just a few years ago. All of this was an overgrazed dust bowl. Locals built fences to keep wild animals off their land. But now that's all changed. The fences have been taken down and animals have been welcomed into a new conservation area.
The community was facing a free fall in loss of land. So when we came in, we had to get rid of 25 kilometers long lines of fences.
It's high season for tourists. Many are heading to the nearby Maasai Mara reserve to watch the great wildebeest migration. But very little economic benefit ever flowed to local communities. That's why the Nashulai Conservation Area decided to do things differently.
We were wary about approaching those institutional funders that funds fortress conservation, because then they will change our narrative. And we wanted to pioneer a model that is community-led.
They want to create one of the longest migration corridors in the region, linking Maasai Mara to other reserves in the Serengeti. 200 people are working on the project. They say they're already seeing the benefits of working together.
Our standard of living's improved. We've put aside money for our children's education through a bursary fund. When times are hard, especially during a drought, community members dip into their contributions to help provide food and other basic commodities.
Tourists often stop over at the village to sample the traditional way of life. It's hoped the Nashulai initiative can inspire others and make conservation a grassroots phenomenon. Michael Apple for Counting the Cost.
Well, let's take this on. I'm joined now from Cape Town by Carlos Lopez, who's the chair of the African Climate Foundation and professor at the University of Cape Town. Carlos, welcome to the programme. So from conservation to energy transition, all need big finance fast. And there are lots of finance pledges, as you know, at the Africa Climate Summit. But pledges are easy to make and easy to break. What do you think of those commitments? And will they be met?
No, most cases of promises and proclamations in these summits don't have a real meaning. And people have become quite hypocritical about these pledges. The reason is that we have now 14 years of record in terms of promises that have not been met. And I think this announcements of about $23 billion for the African Climate Summit are likely to be exactly the same. What we know for sure is that climate financing so far, in terms of constitutionality, is part of official development assistance, it's part of aid. And what we know, because aid is tracked by the OECD, is that there is a reduction of the aid envelope in direction of Africa of about 7% a year. So what we know is that we are likely to see more relabeling rather than new money.
What about this idea of global taxes, carbon taxes? How would that work? Does that have any traction in your view?
It's something that has been under discussion for quite some time. It gained some traction in the Paris Summit for a new financial pact. And I think the Africans are very keen on having some mechanism that will be more global, more predictable than the kind of pledges that we have seen so far. It looks like in the areas like maritime transports and certain logistics and fossil fuel profits, it makes a lot of sense. It will penalize polluters, and it will be very much in line with the idea that we have all common responsibilities, but differentiated responsibilities as well. The common responsibilities are basically the fact that we have to save the planet, but we have not contributed to the problem the same way. And the Africans have been very much in the demanding side of reparations for not having been part of the disaster that we are witnessing right now, and not having been compensated even with access to finance in the same terms as the others.
Right, well, one form of compensation being proposed on a massive scale is carbon credits. Big at the summit, big potential source of revenue too, but there's a lot of criticism, as the NGO PowerShift Africa puts it, they're just a wolf in sheep's clothing, an excuse for polluters to keep on polluting. What's your take?
I was part of a team put together by the Secretary General of the United Nations to look into greenwashing, and this is one form of greenwashing that has become quite common. And our report is about integrity. And if you look into the integrity that is necessary for carbon credits and carbon markets, you will conclude that it is possible to repair some of the damage that has been done in terms of reputation for this very good way of contributing to fixing some of the adaptation difficulties that the Africans and other vulnerable countries are facing. But in order for us to do the right thing, we really need to make clear that whoever is going to buy carbon credits is going to do it as a part of a package that should include very strong mitigation efforts first. And second, we need to make sure that the intermediaries are not going to milk the way and not allowing actually the ones that should receive the credits to have the major advantage of this market. Because right now, what Africans are getting for the real carbon credits emitted is basically less than 10%. So this is becoming a bit of a colonial trap of using a different type of commoditization. And that's why the NGOs are up in arms. But I think, we are not in a situation where we can just disregard this possibility entirely.
All right, hang on there, Carlos, because I want to come back to you in a second on this. Gabon has recently completed Africa's first debt for nature swap deal worth $500 million. The agreement, arranged by the Bank of America, lowers the interest rate on the nation's debt and prolongs repayment periods. In return, Gabon will spend millions of dollars to widen a marine reserve and strengthen fishing regulation. But a recent coup in the nation has sent investors scrambling to assess the impact of the security situation on the contract. Back to you, Carlos, chair of the African Climate Foundation. So, debt for nature swaps, what do you make of them? Are they the way forward?
I think we need serious discussion about debt, because there is an impression that Africans are trapped in debt when in fact their debt to GDP ratio is rather low. What the Africans have is a situation where they pay for whatever they have to contract in terms of sovereign funds, levels of interest rates that others cannot even think of, between 6 and 13%, when countries in Europe, in America, in the United States can actually afford to have subsidies that will allow them to not really be in a playing level field. And yet, in terms of default, in terms of capacities of Africa, we have to generalize the fact that most of the countries have been quite responsible in the way they have dealt with their sovereign responsibilities. You have a few exceptions that have not been able to meet their targets and their obligations. But what we have right now is a liquidity crisis. And because we have a liquidity crisis, we need money. And one possibility is actually to use debt as a way of entering into the climate debate and making sure that we have a type of restructuring that is commensurate with the sort of proclamations that people are making. And that's why debt for nature makes sense. But I think we are not yet at the scale that is necessary. We are really testing the grounds. We have some sort of pilots, Gabon being one case, Seychelles being another, but we are really far from the $1.4 trillion that the Africans need to address the climate transition.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of money, isn't it? A huge amount of investment required. But can investors be confident of investing in Africa when, situations like we see in Gabon and elsewhere in West Africa are going on, the coups and conflicts and general mismanagement of investment funds?
Well, it's a fair question to ask whether the investors will be confident with a political situation that is demonstrating instability and new forms of contestation and coups that are very much linked to these new forms of contestation. But what we have to also realize is that probably most of these coups are a result of the vulnerabilities that resulted from the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the climate crisis. So countries are really in the limit of what they can afford in terms of social programs. The jihadism is actually quite recurrent in the Sahelian region, and most of the Horn of Africa is also affected by it. So you have a situation where a lot of these countries are really in the edge. And part of this is because they are not being able to access liquidity in the international markets. And obviously, if this continues, I expect that we'll have more and more coups or other forms of contestation. So that's why the questions of the investors have to be turned into something that is bigger, more structural. We have to address the global financial governance systems that are not allowing Africans to be, treated the same way as the others. For instance, for renewables, you have investments that are made everywhere in the world right now. So there are more and more investments. The best returns on investment, according to every analysis made, are in Africa because we have 60% of the renewables potential because, the characteristics of the investments are completely different. And yet, this is where you have least investments. It's about 3% of the total. And you can repeat this story over and over and come to the conclusion that Africans are really in a situation where, we are putting the entire continent in a vicious circle.
Okay.
And that's why, instability will provoke the rest.
Carlos, stand by, because I want to come back to you on something you've already alluded to, and that is African leaders urging reform to the global financial system that has left African nations paying nearly 5 times more to borrow money than others. Africa's external debt rose 5-fold between 2000 and 2020. The continent's public debt reached almost $700 billion nearly 3 years ago, and 12% of that money is owed to Chinese lenders. So, Carlos, this reform of the global financial system, which is spearheaded by the Bridgetown Agenda, Prime Minister of Barbados, is that going to come through, do you think? How's it going to shape up?
I think the calls for reform of the Bretton Woods institutions are now heeded by different processes that these institutions themselves have put in place. I have no doubt that we'll have some progress on the capital adequacy that will allow for liberating more and more possibilities of multiplying concessionality with additional money from the private investors because you de-risk some of the investment projects. You have certainly ways of using the SDRs, the special drawing rights, which is like the IMF currency, that would allow for multiplication of projects that would address some of the transition requirements. You have also issues of representativity. Africans are asking for an additional seat in the IMF and also more representation in the World Bank. So I have no doubt that these reforms are going to see the light, and this year is going to be a crucial year for those reforms. This being said, these proposals from Bridgetown, as good as they are not enough to address the volume and the scale of the problems that Africa faces. That's why in this Africa Climate Summit, the Africans are a bit more ambitious. And they have put across a certain number of proposals, particularly in relation to how you deal with fiscal sovereignty and how you deal with global fiscal problems, such as the profit shifting that is allowing for about $24 billion a year to leave the continent, the issue of illicit financial flows, and the issue of actually contributing for an increase of opportunities within the African market with the Continental Free Trade Area. So these are some responses that complement just doing what Bridgetown and what the Bretton Woods institutions are putting in place themselves. And, you know, it's a much more ambitious agenda.
Carlos Lopez, chair of the African Climate Foundation, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, the debt crisis is affecting more than 3 billion people. That's almost half of the world's population. Dozens of developing nations are forced to spend more money paying interest on their debts than on health and education. Many of them are at risk of default. Pakistan needs more than $22 billion to service its debt and pay bills next year. The country has secured a $3 billion deal with the International Monetary Fund to avoid a default on its debt. But the global lender demanded popular subsidies be slashed as part of the conditions for the bailout package. Petrol and electricity prices have rocketed, while a record depreciation of the rupee against the dollar has depleted people's purchasing power. Thousands of traders went on strike last week against the rising cost of living. Let's hear what some Pakistani shop owners and people had to say.
People have been bearing this for the past 70 years, but now it has reached an unbearable level. May God have mercy on us, otherwise we don't see any hope. Look how fast our currency is depreciating against the dollar. It seems like in the future we will take money in a sack to buy bread. There is the issue of our currency as well.
The bills for electricity are very high. Inflation is high too. Petrol prices have gone out of reach. We are labourers. We are daily wages. How can we afford this? It's very difficult. It's too much. Prices have risen more than 200%.
I earn 50,000 rupees a month, and I have received an electricity bill for 26,000 rupees. I can either pay this bill or buy groceries. I also have to pay bills for gas, and then have to pay for school fees for my children. Last month, I had to sell a gold chain belonging to my wife to pay for my children's overdue school fees.
Well, to discuss all of this, I'm joined now from Islamabad by Amma Habib Khan. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council South Asia Centre, also the chief executive officer at Credit Book Financial Services. Amma Khan, welcome to Al Jazeera. First up, tell us more about the impact of the electricity price hike on ordinary people.
The price hike has been disastrous for a lot of households because they were not expecting the hike to be this much. As electricity prices have been consistently increasing, I would say they have doubled in less than 3 years, and incomes have not changed accordingly. So obviously, electricity prices continue to make up a significant portion of a household income. Now, we must consider that food inflation over the last 1 year has been 50%. So household incomes or disposable income is already fairly stretched. And when you add to that increasing electricity or utility bills, that just adds a lot of stress and strain to the process. Due to this, it's been very difficult for households, particularly for households which are, I would call, lifeline customers, and which make up about 60% of total connections in the country. People are reducing the electricity consumption, but there is so much consumption that you can reduce at a certain point. What's actually happening right now is because electricity bills have increased so much, people do not have the capacity to pay anymore. So people are actually defaulting on their payments or paying less. This results in higher line losses or lower collections as the government is not able to collect bills, which leads to further problems as well. So
Right.
I just feel that in terms of electricity prices, we've reached a tipping point at this stage.
Is it just the removal of subsidies that's to blame here?
It's not really removal of subsidies. Subsidies are, I would say, unfairly blamed here. What's really happened is the government has kept on increasing the taxes on electricity prices because the government continues to run a fiscal deficit, and it has been running a fiscal deficit for the last many years. It utilizes electricity bills as a crutch to increase the tax revenue. So even right now, in terms of electricity tariffs, 30% of the tariff, or I would say 33% of the tariff, is just government taxes. So because of increase in taxes, that led to higher bills. So it's not really subsidy, but more indirect taxation, which is hurting the most vulnerable households more than anyone else.
The government has come up with an electricity relief plan, which has been turned down by the IMF. What do you make of the lenders' conditions? Do you think they could benefit Pakistani people?
The lender here, the IMF, is very clear in its mandate. It just wants a fiscal surplus, a primary surplus, such that the government revenues are greater than its expenses. It will not specifically talk about electricity bills. What it wants is actually the government to start increasing its revenues. So if the government goes with a plan, hey, we are reducing taxes on the electricity bills, but increasing taxes in other areas, that should be fine as well. So I just feel that the IMF is just made a scapegoat in this whole process, but it's actually the responsibility of the government to actually increase more direct taxes, broaden the tax net rather than just taxing the most vulnerable households again and again.
Lots of countries offering loans to Pakistan, including China. But is that just leading the country into debt traps?
The country is already in a debt trap right now as we speak, and that's not due to external factors or external countries. It's largely due to internal factors as well, because over the last 12 to 15 months, we haven't been able to raise a lot of external debt or dollar-based debt anyway. So what's really happening is we're just raising a lot of local debt, a lot of rupee-denominated debt, which means that a lot of our local expenses are increasing and the same are being covered through debt. So we're already in a debt trap right now. What China is actually doing is maybe helping Pakistan alleviate some of that pain by restructuring some of the power sector loans, providing support as and when required. But if I look over the last 12 to 15 months, not a lot of external debt has come into Pakistan. If anything, external debt for Pakistan has actually reduced in the last 15 months. And that's largely because we haven't gotten any additional debt, or whatever needed to be paid has been repaid without it being refinanced.
Overall, what do you think is the way out of Pakistan's debt crisis? And might things improve after the election, do you think?
The only way out, why do we take debt? That is a structural, fundamental question. We take debt because our expenses are greater than revenue. So the way out of this is essentially trying to fix our fiscal position. We need to reduce our expenses, lots of spurious expenditure that continues to happen, and increase our revenues. Once that equation starts to change, the cumulative debt we assume is gradually going to go down, and we can slowly and steadily come out of this crisis. But if we do not stop spending, if we keep on spending, if we keep on running more and more deficits, eventually we will reach a point where we'll have to keep adding more and more debt till the point it gets unsustainable. And if the same continues, if the status quo continues, this may worsen the situation. If there's a new government in place that will have a mandate to be more aggressive in terms of direct taxation, that will have a clear mandate in terms of reducing expenditure. So yes, a new government is extremely critical at this juncture, because that will have the mandate to take the right or more structural and long-term decisions. An interim government may not have the capacity or even the mandate to take such decisions.
Great to get your perspective on this, Amar Khan. Thank you.
Thank you.
And there's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything you've seen, you can tweet me at Nick Clark Al Jazz. Please use the hashtag AJCDC, or just drop us an email. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net is our address. Plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and indeed entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Nick Clark from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is coming right up.